So imagine this. A god of vengeance, forged in the fires of Olympus, suddenly unleashed in the grim darkness of the Warhammer 40K universe. Titans crumble, armies scatter, and nothing, not space marines, not orcs, not even daemons, can stand in his way. What happens when Kratos enters a war where the strongest are still just mortals? Watch closely, because this changes everything. The air above the battlefield shimmered unnaturally, a tension that made even the most battle-hardened space marines falter for a moment. A rift in the warp tore open the sky, a jagged scar that bled colors no mortal eye could name, swirling with raw, chaotic energy that hummed with anticipation. From this tearing in reality, a figure emerged, larger than life, each movement radiating a power that seemed to bend the very air around him. Chains coiled around his forearms, glowing faintly as if alive with a light from some ancient godlike forge, and his eyes burned with the kind of fury that could silence even the most unyielding of warriors. The ground beneath him seemed to tremble as he took his first steps, every footfall cracking stone and scorched earth alike, leaving behind a path that bore the mark of divine wrath. Dust and debris were lifted into a swirling vortex around him. As if the battlefield itself recognized that something beyond mortal reckoning had arrived. Soldiers on both sides froze, caught between instinct and disbelief. Space Marines, trained to fight gods and monsters in the legends of their chapters, could scarcely comprehend the raw, palpable menace before them. Their bolters trembled in their hands, not from fear of recoil, but from the undeniable sense that their weapons, forged to pierce tanks and demons, might be as useless as paper in the presence of this being. Kratos moved with a calculated aggression, muscles coiled and flexed, under skin that glistened with sweat and scars, each one a testament to centuries of combat and survival. The chains he wielded were no mere weapons. They seemed extensions of his will, slithering and striking with a precision that defied the laws of physics, each lash tearing into armor and flesh alike. Sparks flew as they collided with the armored fists of Space Marines, each contact ringing out like the tolling of a doom bell across the battlefield. Even the air seemed to resist him, thickening with a pressure that bore down on the soldiers around him, as though the very atmosphere was aware that it was in the presence of a being born of both vengeance and divinity. Smoke curled from wrecked tanks and shattered ruins, mingling with the ethereal light emanating from the warp rift, casting grotesque shadows that danced across Kratos' chiseled form. The light caught his eyes, revealing a storm of emotion within them, rage, determination, and a haunting sorrow that spoke of countless battles fought and allies lost. His voice, when it came, was a low, resonant growl, carrying across the battlefield with an authority that silenced chatter and quelled even the bravest hearts. Words were unnecessary, for every movement, every strike of his chain conveyed a story of power and wrath that left no room for negotiation or surrender. The first clash came swiftly. A unit of Terminators, their ceramite armor gleaming under the muted sun, stepped forward to confront him, their halberds raised in a synchronized, disciplined advance. They struck together, a wall of steel meant to channel strength through unity. Yet Kratos met them with a force that seemed to bend reality itself. He swung the Blades of Chaos in a wide arc. The chains slicing through the air with a sound like thunder rolling across a mountain valley. Limbs were severed, armor splintered, and bodies were thrown with such force that the ground itself cracked under the impact. Each Terminator that fell only seemed to fuel the storm within him, his movements growing faster, more precise, more terrifying in their inevitability. There was no hesitation, no doubt, only a singular focus, an unrelenting drive to move forward, to conquer, to impose his will upon this alien and chaotic war zone. Witnessing this, even the seasoned leaders of the Imperium could only gape. Commanders barked orders that were immediately rendered obsolete as Kratos moved past defensive lines as if they were paper, his chains tearing through turrets and fortifications, creating openings where none should exist. The battlefield itself seemed to adapt to his presence, debris shifting underfoot in anticipation of his strikes, explosions echoing as if responding to the rhythm of his rage. Soldiers found themselves reacting not out of strategy, but instinct, their minds screaming that survival was impossible against this unstoppable force. Chaos daemons recoiled, sensing a power that rivaled the warp in its intensity, unsure whether to flee or fight, their eldritch forms quivering under the weight of his divine presence. The air thrummed with the tension of inevitability, each second stretching as Kratos moved with a deliberate inevitability that left no room for hesitation. Even those who had faced horrors beyond imagination, veterans of campaigns across the stars, felt the raw weight of awe pressing down on them. The chains coiled around his arms, now glowing brighter as if fed by the very fear and anticipation surrounding him. Striking out with an almost conscious intelligence, anticipating attacks before they came. Each blow was calculated but instinctual, a perfect marriage of skill and divine fury that left the battlefield awash in a choreography of destruction. Smoke and dust rose in plumes, obscuring vision, yet Kratos moved through it unimpeded, as if the chaos around him merely highlighted the inevitability of his march forward. The ground was littered with shattered weapons, broken armor, and the remnants of warriors who had dared to confront him, a testament to his absolute dominance in the moment. He paused for only a heartbeat, scanning the battlefield with a keen, predatory gaze. There was a weight to his presence, a gravity that seemed to pull at the souls of those who witnessed him, compelling respect, fear, and awe simultaneously. The warp rift continued to pulse behind him, a reminder that his arrival was no accident, that the fabric of the universe itself had bent to allow this moment. And in that stillness, fleeting yet profound, the soldiers understood something fundamental. This was not merely a warrior. This was a force of nature incarnate, and the venging storm that had no allegiance, no hesitation, only the relentless drive to unleash devastation upon any who opposed him. Every footfall, every chain swing, every glance carried the weight of eons of battles fought and victories won, the culmination of a life defined by struggle, rage, and the endless pursuit of retribution. Comprehension, daemons born of the warp, titanic Tyranid creatures that consumed entire planets, and even rogue psychers capable of tearing minds apart. But nothing could have prepared them for the raw, godlike presence that now moved toward them. Kratos did not walk like a man. He advanced with the inevitability of a natural disaster, each step resonating with authority and menace, and each breath a challenge to the universe itself. The sun glinted off the blades of the chains coiled around his forearms, reflecting a crimson fury that seemed to set the very air aflame. There was no hesitation in his movements, no second-guessing, only the focused, unyielding determination of a being for whom war was not merely an occupation, but a way of life, a relentless pursuit of victory and vengeance. The Space Marines tightened their formations instinctively, bolters at the ready, power swords humming with deadly potential. Even the most stoic among them, veterans of countless engagements, felt a twinge of unease as their practice drills and battle strategies seemed almost trivial in the face of Kratos' presence. His aura radiated something that defied description, a mixture of raw physical might, divine authority, and a primal rage that seemed to warp the very atmosphere. The ground beneath him bore the marks of his arrival, cracked stone, scorched earth, and jagged impressions that pulsed faintly with energy, each one a testament to the force he carried. He moved through the battlefield with a purpose that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. A predator whose prey was the entire world around him, and whose instincts were honed to strike without mercy or hesitation. As the first line of Space Marines advanced to intercept, Kratos' eyes swept over them, taking in their armor, their weapons, and the disciplined formations that had once made them nearly unstoppable. There was a flicker of recognition in his gaze, an acknowledgement of their skill and their potential threat, but it was fleeting. He assessed their movements with a calculating precision, anticipating their strikes before they were even initiated, and then struck with a speed that seemed almost supernatural. The Blades of Chaos whipped through the air in a blur, chains snapping and hissing as they met armor and flesh alike. The sound of metal tearing, screams of battle, and the roar of engines filled the air. Yet Kratos remained a singular, focused force amid the chaos, moving with the grace and lethality of a being who had fought wars that spanned both gods and monsters. Even the commanders felt the weight of his gaze upon them, a pressure that seemed to test not only their courage, but their very purpose. Orders were shouted, strategies adjusted, but Kratos was already beyond their calculations, moving through their lines as if the concept of defense were meaningless. Each swing of his chain sent shockwaves across the battlefield, toppling the strongest warriors and shattering their formations with brutal efficiency. Dust and debris swirled around him, the chaos of combat bending around his movements, yet he remained unscathed, a figure of absolute dominance whose presence alone seemed to destabilize the carefully orchestrated machinery of war. Space Marines attempted to regroup, to mount a coordinated counterattack, but the inevitability of his approach rendered their tactics almost comical in their futility. Even the bravest among them felt an instinctive recognition that this was no ordinary enemy. They were facing a being whose very existence redefined the meaning of power and danger. The battlefield itself seemed to respond to him, as though aware of the divine force that had entered its midst. Explosions erupted, not merely from weapons, but seemingly from the energy of his steps, the chain's movement, and the sheer intensity of his presence. The smoke and dust mingled with the eerie glow of the warp rift from which he had emerged, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the ruins and fortifications. The Space Marines found themselves reacting less as soldiers following orders and more as creatures trying to survive against an unstoppable force of nature. Every movement Kratos made, carried with it the inevitability of destruction, and even those trained to face the horrors of the galaxy could feel the primal dread of being insignificant in the face of such overwhelming might. The first clash was devastating. Assault squads leapt forward, power fists and chainswords ready to strike, yet Kratos met them with a precision and brutality that left no room for error. Limbs were torn from bodies, armor was splintered as if it were paper, and the echoes of battle cries were swallowed by the roar of chains whipping through the air. Each strike was both controlled and instinctual, a deadly dance that demonstrated not only his raw strength, but a tactical mind honed by centuries of combat. The Space Marines tried to adapt, to anticipate his next move, but it was as if he existed one step ahead of time itself. Every attack countered with an unerring, devastating response that left survivors scrambling to comprehend what they were witnessing. Even the observers, from the high command, could not hide their astonishment. Strategists and tacticians, who had spent lifetimes mastering the art of war, watched in disbelief as Kratos dismantled formations, tore through fortifications, and ignored conventional vulnerabilities with ease. His presence challenged every preconception they held about power, tactics, and the nature of the universe. The raw, tangible energy he exuded seemed to seep into the minds of those around him, creating a tension that was almost unbearable, a constant reminder that they were in the presence of something beyond comprehension. Daemons, sensing the singular focus of his fury, hesitated in their assaults, unsure whether to flee or confront him, while the ground itself seemed to echo the inevitability of his advance. And yet, amid all the chaos and destruction, there was a strange order to Kratos' movements. Each step, each swing of the chains, and each calculated strike carried the weight of someone who understood the rhythm of battle instinctively, as though the battlefield itself were a canvas, and he the master artist painting strokes of devastation with unerring precision. His eyes, burning with a mixture of rage and resolve, scanned constantly, seeking out the next threat, the next obstacle, the next opponent to test his might. Even those who had faced impossible odds before could not deny the magnetic force of his presence, the way every movement drew attention and demanded recognition. Chaos erupted across the battlefield as Kratos advanced, his presence a living storm that defied all expectations. The demons of the warp, creatures that had terrorized countless worlds and twisted entire armies into submission, faltered in the face of him. They had come forth from the immaterium with snarling anticipation, certain that they would find another collection of mortal flesh to rip apart. Yet they found themselves confronted by something far beyond their comprehension. Kratos did not scream or roar like them, nor did he writhe with the grotesque energy of the warp. He moved with a precision, a calculated fury that seemed to render their chaotic forms sluggish and uncertain. Their claws and talons swiped through the air, weapons of pure nightmare. Yet each strike found only empty space, or was shattered by the snapping chains that Kratos wielded like extensions of his own will. Even the air around him seemed to resist their intrusion, thickening and vibrating as though the universe itself recognized that this warrior was no ordinary mortal, no creature bound to the limitations of flesh or fear. The daemons hesitated, their many eyes widening in confusion and something akin to fear. In their existence, power had always dictated dominance. Yet here was a force that ignored their laws, that seemed impervious to their most violent assaults. Bolstered by the chaotic energy of the warp, they had thought themselves unstoppable, and now they questioned everything they had known. Even the lowest of daemons, those driven solely by hunger and instinct, recoiled instinctively from the aura of pure, unrelenting wrath that radiated from Kratos. Each movement of his chains, each flex of his muscles, sent vibrations through the battlefield that unsettled them, making their own movements erratic, as if they were no longer in control of themselves. Their leader, a greater daemon of grotesque majesty and malice, tried to rally them, but even its commands sounded hollow, lost in the oppressive weight of Kratos' presence. Kratos' eyes scanned the battlefield with a cold intensity. Every motion, every breath seemed to have a purpose beyond survival or victory. It was as though the fury and experience of centuries of battle had condensed into a single, unstoppable form. The daemons lunged again, now with a desperation that was almost palpable, their attacks growing more frenzied and uncoordinated. Chains whipped through the air, meeting claws and talons with a crack that echoed across the shattered plains. The impact sent shockwaves through the ground, toppling lesser creatures and shattering the illusions of invincibility that the greater daemons had carried with them into the material world. Blood and ichor sprayed across the battlefield, yet Kratos moved unharmed, his focus unbroken, as though the very violence around him was nothing more than a test of his speed and resolve. The warp itself seemed to shudder in his presence. Energies that had shaped realities and corrupted entire worlds were disrupted by the force of his being. Cries of rage and confusion filled the air as the daemons tried to recalibrate, to summon reinforcements. Yet every attempt was met with swift, decisive strikes. The chains lashed with supernatural precision, snaking around limbs, crushing bone, and sending screams of agony echoing across the battlefield. It was a dance of destruction, a symphony of violence in which Kratos was both conductor and unstoppable instrument. Even when outnumbered, the daemons found that their collective strength was insufficient to halt him. The very ground quaked under the weight of his wrath, and the air shimmered with the heat of exertion, warping reality around him just enough to make the impossible seem inevitable. The lesser daemons fell first, their shrieks piercing the smoke-filled air as they were shredded, thrown aside or impaled by the chains. Their greater brethren, towering and grotesque, struck with renewed fury, hoping to overwhelm him through sheer numbers and size. Kratos met each assault with unwavering resolve, his movements flowing seamlessly between offense and defense. The Blades of Chaos swung in arcs that cleaved both flesh and armor, chains wrapping around limbs, torsos, and weaponry, tearing them away in a display of raw, calculated power. Every strike was measured yet savage, each one delivering both pain and a clear message. None could withstand him. The daemons were no longer attacking out of strategy. They attacked out of panic, instinctively driven by the survival instinct that now dominated their corrupted minds. Kratos' pace never faltered. His steps left fissures in the battlefield, jagged cracks that split the soil, and sent shards of rock and debris flying into the chaos around him. The daemons began to scatter, uncertain whether to flee or continue the hopeless fight. The greater daemon, enraged and desperate to assert control, attempted a final coordinated strike, gathering its minions for a concentrated assault designed to overwhelm him. Yet even this display of raw warp-fueled power faltered. Kratos moved with a terrifying efficiency, striking first at the leadership, tearing through the greater daemon with an almost effortless display of strength and sending shockwaves of fear cascading through its subordinates. Without their leader, the cohesion of the daemon horde dissolved, leaving a chaos of screaming, flailing forms in his wake. Smoke, fire, and the smell of ozone and blood filled the air as Kratos pressed onward, unstoppable and indifferent to the number of foes arrayed against him. The battlefield was becoming unrecognizable, littered with the wreckage of those who had dared to challenge him. The daemons that remained hesitated at each step, their unnatural instincts warning them that this mortal, or perhaps something beyond mortal, was a force they could not comprehend, let alone defeat. Kratos moved like a living embodiment of war itself, precise and unrelenting, every strike an equation of vengeance and power that the creatures of the warp could neither predict nor counter. Even in the midst of destruction, there was a rhythm to his assault, a clarity that separated him from the mindless slaughter surrounding him. The daemons that had once surged forward with confidence now scrambled in disarray, unable to find purchase against the unstoppable force that Kratos represented. Each chain strike and blade swing carved through the battlefield like a sculptor shaping marble with divine anger, leaving scars that would linger long after the battle had ended. They realized, too late, that their strength and their chaos were meaningless before a power born of divine wrath and honed by centuries of war, that even their most fearsome abilities were no match for the unstoppable presence that now walked among them. The battlefield trembled beneath the relentless advance of Kratos, a force of destruction unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. Where once the war had followed the rigid structure of strategy, formations, and tactical calculations, now it dissolved into a chaotic crucible, molded by his sheer presence. Tanks, towering titans, and monstrous war engines that had inspired awe and terror alike were reduced to rubble under the might of his relentless assault. Each swing of his blades of chaos cleaved through steel as if it were paper, sending molten fragments scattering across the battlefield. The ground shook with every footfall, fissures splitting the scorched earth in his wake, while the air itself seemed to bend, carrying with it the scent of smoke, burning oil, and the metallic tang of blood. Soldiers and commanders alike stared in disbelief, their drills and formations crumbling before an unstoppable force whose violence defied reason. As Kratos moved, every engagement became a whirlwind of destruction. A squad of space marines, disciplined and trained to face horrors that would freeze ordinary humans in their tracks, advanced with bolters raised. They fired volley after volley of superheated rounds, each bolt striking the chains and armor of Kratos with sparks and ricochets, yet their weapons barely slowed him. He weaved through the hail of gunfire with fluid precision, chains lashing out in arcs that tore through armored limbs and shattered reinforced ceramite plates. Where once their movements would have been decisive, now they were merely fodder for a warrior whose strength and skill exceeded all mortal expectations. Even the most fearsome dreadnoughts, walking tanks of mechanized fury, were flung aside like toys, their massive fists striking air as Kratos' chains tore into their joints, engines exploding in clouds of smoke and fire. The monstrous creatures of alien worlds, Orks and Tyranids alike, had thought themselves apex predators in this war-torn universe. Swarms of Tyranid warriors surged toward him, claws and talons tearing at anything in reach. Yet Kratos cut through them in a blur of motion, their numbers meaningless against the precision of his strikes. Orc war bosses bellowed in rage, their massive choppas cleaving at the air, but even their brute strength failed to faze him. He met every attack with a combination of brute force and tactical finesse, chains wrapping around limbs, torsos, and weapons, tearing enemies apart before they could even comprehend the danger. The battlefield was a chaotic symphony of violence, with Kratos as the conductor, orchestrating destruction on a scale that made ordinary war seem trivial. Entire fortresses and strongholds fell under his relentless drive. Gun emplacements exploded as chains tore through fortified walls, sending debris raining onto the ground below. Barricades, once thought impregnable, were reduced to splinters as he carved a path forward, leaving behind a trail of devastation that seemed almost alive, responding to his will. Soldiers scrambled to adapt, trying to form new lines, attempting to mount resistance. Yet every maneuver was anticipated and countered with lethal efficiency. His eyes, burning with divine rage, scanned the battlefield continuously, locating threats and eliminating them before they could coordinate into effective resistance. The scale of destruction was staggering, and even veteran commanders found themselves paralyzed, unable to adjust their strategies fast enough to cope with an adversary who ignored conventional rules entirely. Above the battlefield, the sky was a canvas of chaos. Smoke, fire, and the strange, otherworldly glow of the warp rift intermingled, casting a surreal light over the carnage. War engines erupted, their pilots screaming as hulls disintegrated beneath the force of Kratos' assault. Tyranid monstrosities, towering and vicious, were hurled across the battlefield by the sheer impact of his strikes, their screeches mingling with the roar of explosions and the grinding metal of destroyed tanks. Even the environment seemed to respond to his presence, with trees uprooted, buildings collapsing, and craters forming wherever his chains struck the earth. The natural laws of physics seemed to bend in his wake, as if the universe itself acknowledged that a being of such power could not be contained by ordinary limits. Despite the overwhelming chaos, there was an order to Kratos' destruction. Each strike was deliberate, each movement calculated to maximize devastation while minimizing wasted effort. When a titan swung its massive arms to crush him, he ducked and twisted, using the momentum against it, chains wrapping around a limb and wrenching it with such force that the machine staggered, collapsed, and then erupted in fire. When bolter rounds struck him, he shifted with predatory grace, striking back at the firing positions, tearing apart squads before they could reload. His focus never wavered, a storm of calculated violence that left every observer, human, alien, or daemon, awestruck. There was no hesitation, no doubt, only the inexorable force of a being who understood war on a scale that transcended mortal comprehension. As Kratos advanced deeper into the battlefield, alliances formed in haste among his enemies, desperation pushing them to unite against the singular threat. Orks and Tyranids, chaos cultists, and imperial defenders tried to converge their attacks, hoping that numbers could overcome his power. But he moved like a force of nature, reading the flow of combat with an almost supernatural intuition. Chains whipped through the masses, striking multiple targets simultaneously, while the blades of chaos sliced through the thick hides of monstrous foes. The ground was littered with wreckage, shattered armor, broken weapons, mangled creatures, and the remains of titanic machines. And yet, through it all, Kratos pressed forward, an unstoppable axis around which the battlefield spun in chaos and destruction. Smoke and embers swirled around him as he paused only briefly to survey his path, each glance revealing new threats that he would annihilate with methodical fury. The sounds of war, screams, explosions, the grinding of metal, and the unholy wails of the warp became a symphony under his control, each note punctuated by the destruction he wrought. Soldiers tried to flee, alien beasts recoiled, and commanders cursed their inability to contain him. But nothing could halt the march of Kratos. Every formation broken, every weapon rendered useless, every defensive strategy nullified, testified to a simple, horrifying truth. In this war, no conventional force could withstand the raw, unbridled power of a god unleashed upon the battlefield. The Eldar watched from the shadows of their sleek and alien craft, their long fingers twitching nervously over the controls of their psychic instruments. Centuries of experience and foresight had taught them to anticipate threats, to read the currents of war before they surged across the battlefield. But Kratos was unlike anything they had ever encountered. The moment his form appeared, emerging from the jagged, chaotic rift in the warp, a ripple of uncertainty spread through their ranks. He did not radiate the familiar distortions of psychic energy, nor did his presence conform to the rules that even the Eldar themselves had long understood. He moved with a singular, terrifying focus, his chains coiling and whipping with a speed and precision that defied logic. A predator who seemed capable of predicting the ebb and flow of every attack before it was made. Farseers whispered warnings to one another, their voices tight with tension, while warlocks tightened their grips on their wraithbone staves, trying to sense some pattern in the storm that had descended upon the battlefield. Yet no premonition, no intricate web of psychic foresight could fully account for the raw, unrelenting force of Kratos. He was a singularity, a living embodiment of war itself, a being whose instincts were honed beyond mortal comprehension. Each movement he made challenged the Eldar's understanding of the universe. His chains struck not just at physical bodies, but at the confidence of those who dared oppose him, tearing through both steel and spirit alike. The Eldar attempted manipulation, subtle shifts in the currents of the battlefield, trying to direct lesser forces into advantageous positions, to set traps that might ensnare even a being of his might. Yet even their most elegant strategies faltered before him. Kratos seemed to sense intention and consequence as though they were tangible objects in the air, adjusting his path and strikes with an instinctive brilliance that left the Eldar disoriented. Their psychic projections, meant to deceive or weaken him, were met with a clarity in his gaze that bordered on the supernatural, as if he could see not only the present, but the possibilities of every imminent action. This was not just a warrior. This was a force that bent perception and anticipation, reducing their carefully laid plans to little more than ineffective gestures in the face of inevitable destruction. The battlefield became a stage of impossible complexity as Kratos advanced. His chains tore through the ranks of Imperial Guard and Space Marines alike, carving a path of devastation that threatened to render every tactical maneuver meaningless. Eldar forces tried to divert him, to channel his movement toward isolated positions, but he twisted and turned with an uncanny awareness, countering each attempt with fluid precision. Warp energy surged around him, responding to the fury and power that seemed to emanate naturally from his very being. Even the mightiest psychic attacks were disrupted by the raw force of his presence, as though reality itself bent to accommodate the overwhelming inevitability of his onslaught. Despite their centuries of training and experience, the Eldar were forced to acknowledge a terrifying truth. Kratos was untouchable by conventional means. No amount of foresight, no careful orchestration of units, no manipulation of the battlefield could match the singular focus and raw power that defined his every action. Their vehicles, skimmers, and sleek war machines were torn apart or repurposed by his chains and blades of chaos. Their drivers flung across the battlefield like ragdolls. Even when they attempted coordinated strikes, targeting his limbs or trying to confine him with psychic traps, Kratos moved with a terrifying understanding of their intentions, dismantling each attempt before it could take hold. The Eldar realized that this was a confrontation not merely of skill, but of essence. Kratos was a being whose very presence disrupted the fabric of control they relied upon, a living storm that no foresight could contain. From above, the shining banners of their craft worlds glinted in the smoke and fire. Yet each Eldar warrior, whether Farseer, Warlock, or Guardian, felt a cold awareness settling over them. They had faced horrors that had bent reality, demons that had corrupted entire worlds, and warlords whose armies could crush planets, but nothing had prepared them for this. Kratos did not simply attack. He reshaped the battlefield as he moved, forcing reactions and dictating outcomes through sheer force of will. Even the most cunning Eldar strategists found themselves reacting rather than orchestrating, their intentions thwarted before they could manifest. The elegance of their tactics, honed over millennia, crumbled under the weight of his unstoppable momentum. Kratos' chains whipped through the air with a speed that blurred vision, striking both foe and environment with devastating effect. He tore through vehicles, demolishing weapons platforms and scattering squads with brutal efficiency. The Eldar attempted to anticipate each strike, their psychic projections rippling out in waves designed to influence or hinder him, but he seemed impervious. Each movement was measured yet instinctual, precise yet savage. And every foe he encountered was subjected to the same overwhelming force. The battlefield became a maze of twisted metal, shattered stone, and the bodies of those who had dared oppose him. Smoke and dust rose in spirals, mingling with the eerie glow of the warp, yet Kratos moved unhindered, a singular presence of wrath and dominance. In moments of brief pause, Kratos' eyes would sweep the battlefield, his gaze landing on every enemy, as if cataloging them for future strikes. Eldar observers, their minds trained to perceive the flow of battle and the potential of every opponent, shuddered under the realization that even their most subtle manipulations were insufficient. They could not predict him, they could not outmaneuver him, and they could not influence his actions. Kratos operated on a plane of understanding that transcended conventional perception, blending raw instinct with a tactical awareness born of centuries of combat. The battlefield, once a complex theater of strategy and planning, had become a crucible where only his will dictated the outcome. Even the boldest Eldar warriors hesitated, their psychic energy fluctuating in response to the sheer weight of his presence. Each time he moved, the currents of the battlefield seemed to shift, reality bending subtly to accommodate his path. Forces that had been poised to strike, coordinated and ready, found themselves thrown into disarray, their calculations rendered meaningless. The subtle manipulations of the Farseers, the elegant strikes of the Warlocks, the precise fire of the Guardians, all were diminished before the unstoppable, godlike fury that Kratos brought to bear. It became painfully clear that no amount of psychic finesse, no mastery of foresight, and no elegance of strategy could fully account for the power of a being who ignored rules and shattered expectations with every movement. The battlefield quaked under the weight of converging forces as Kratos advanced, a storm of raw power and relentless fury that left nothing untouched in his path. Orks, massive and brimming with crude aggression, surged forward with guttural roars, swinging enormous choppas and firing ramshackle weapons that spat death indiscriminately. Beside them, Tyranid swarms spilled across the terrain in terrifying cohesion, claws, teeth, and biocannons converging in an instinctual drive to consume all life before them. The ground became a living chaos of green-skinned brutality and alien ferocity, and yet, at the center of it all, Kratos stood unshaken, a singular axis around which the storm revolved. Every creature, whether driven by instinct, rage, or sheer appetite, felt the oppressive weight of his presence, an almost tangible force that bent the battlefield to his will. As the Orks and Tyranids collided with him, their numbers seemed overwhelming at first, a tide of violence intent on breaking anything in its path. Yet Kratos moved with a precision that belied the chaos around him, chains snapping and blades of chaos slicing through armor, flesh, and exoskeleton alike. Ork war bosses, towering and aggressive, charged with a reckless abandon that could have crushed lesser foes. But Kratos met them with a calm, calculated brutality. The chains wrapped around limbs and torsos with terrifying efficiency, tearing enemies apart while leaving no opening for retaliation. Tyranid, monstrous creatures leapt forward, their serrated limbs cutting through the smoke and debris. But even their speed and sheer predatory instinct were insufficient against a being whose movements seemed almost prescient, a predator who anticipated the rhythm of attack before it was initiated. The battlefield was a maelstrom of sound and movement. Orc shrieks, Tyranid screeches, the grinding of machinery, and the crackle of explosions blended into a symphony of chaos. Yet Kratos moved through it as if conducting an orchestra of devastation. Dust, blood, and ichor mingled in the air, creating a haze that obscured vision. But he advanced with unerring focus, eyes scanning for the next threat, the next challenge to test his might. Every strike carried both force and precision, dismantling groups of enemies with an efficiency that bordered on artistry. Limbs were severed, armor shattered, and monstrous forms hurled into the air by the force of his chains. Yet Kratos remained unscathed, a singular storm of unstoppable wrath in the heart of alien carnage. Even the Orks, Creatures whose entire existence thrived on aggression and overwhelming numbers found themselves disoriented. Their crude strategies and instinctive tactics failed to account for a warrior whose strength was both superhuman and godlike. War bosses bellowed orders, attempting to rally their mobs, but each command seemed futile against the unstoppable trajectory of Kratos' assault. Tyranid synapse creatures screeched, attempting to coordinate their swarms through psychic influence. Yet the unnatural presence of Kratos disrupted even these signals, throwing their bioconstructs into confusion and disarray. Swarms collided, creatures fell in waves, and the ground became slick with blood and ichor. But still he pressed forward, each movement a testament to his singular dominance. Kratos' chains struck with a terrifying rhythm, wrapping around massive orc choppas and Tyranid limbs alike, using the momentum of the attackers against them. A hulking warboss was lifted into the air, thrashing wildly before being thrown into a Tyranid carnifex, the two colliding with explosive force that sent shockwaves through the battlefield. Smaller Tyranid gaunts were torn apart mid-leap, their numbers irrelevant against the precision and power of his strikes. Every swing of the Blades of Chaos was a lesson in destruction, each movement carving a path that reshaped the battlefield itself. Rocks shattered, vehicles were overturned, and even the smoke and haze seemed to part before him, creating a visual corridor through which his wrath flowed unhindered. The orcs attempted to adjust, relying on sheer stubbornness and the collective ferocity of their mobs to overwhelm him. Yet Kratos' understanding of combat, honed over centuries of conflict, rendered their efforts meaningless. Each mob that approached was met with calculated strikes, every charge anticipated and countered with lethal efficiency. Tyranid creatures attempted to flank him, swarming from multiple directions in a coordinated assault. But he pivoted, chains and blades moving in arcs that cut off escape routes and dismantled offensive formations before they could converge. Even when faced with simultaneous threats, Kratos reacted instinctively, moving through a choreography of destruction that made it impossible for the aliens to mount any effective opposition. Amidst the chaos, the landscape itself became a weapon under his feet. Craters formed from the impact of monstrous bodies hurled by his chains. Trees and structures splintered under the force of his attacks, and fires ignited, consuming whatever cover the enemy might have used. Smoke and ash swirled in great clouds, yet he remained the center of clarity in the storm, a force whose momentum was unstoppable. The battlefield seemed almost sentient in response, debris shifting and collapsing under the weight of combat, amplifying the terror and confusion of those who faced him. Even the most daring Tyranid predators, accustomed to overwhelming entire planetary forces, hesitated at the sheer brutality and efficiency of his strikes, realizing that instinct alone would not prevail here. Orc mobs tried to retreat and regroup, their numbers thinning as Kratos continued his inexorable advance. Tyranid swarms attempted to encircle him, coordinating attacks through desperate psychic impulses. But he moved faster than they could react, his chains tearing through their ranks and leaving a path of devastation in his wake. Every attack served a dual purpose: destruction and psychological domination. The sheer scale of his assault instilled panic, disorder, and hesitation among even the most fearless of attackers, turning their natural aggression into vulnerability. What had begun as a tide of alien aggression was now a controlled storm, orchestrated by the unstoppable presence of Kratos. each movement reducing chaos to his singular purpose and demonstrating a force beyond comprehension. Amid the carnage, Kratos' eyes scanned constantly, seeking the next adversary, the next challenge to assert his dominance. Orcs roared in frustration as their plans fell apart. Tyranid synapse creatures shrieked in desperation, and yet every effort to halt him seemed insignificant. Chains and blades moved with unstoppable force. Bodies, armor, and alien flesh torn apart with devastating precision. Smoke, blood, and fire surrounded him, creating a scene of apocalyptic carnage. Yet his focus never wavered. The battlefield was no longer a place of conventional war, but a theater in which his singular fury dictated the flow of conflict, demonstrating that raw power and skill could bend even the most monstrous and disciplined forces to his will. Kratos moved through the battlefield with a relentless purpose, the echoes of his chains lashing against armor and stone, reverberating across the desolate plains. His rage was a living thing, consuming every obstacle in its path, guiding his steps toward the heart of the chaos stronghold that loomed like a festering wound in the scarred landscape. The warp storms that surrounded it writhed with unnatural energy, the very air shimmering with malevolent intent. Yet Kratos advanced unflinchingly, undeterred by the corruptive powers that had driven entire armies to madness. Every step seemed to sap the courage of those who watched from the periphery, as though the ground itself recognized that a being born of vengeance and divinity was moving toward the very source of the universe's most vile corruption. The Chaos Stronghold was a monstrous fortress of jagged metal and warped stone, pulsing with dark energy that threatened to tear reality apart. Warp-tainted daemons patrolled its ramparts, their grotesque forms shifting in ways that defy mortal perception, eyes glowing with malevolent intent as they sensed the intrusion of one who did not belong. Kratos' eyes burned with determination, and his muscles tensed as he approached. Every fiber of his being focused on the annihilation of the enemy that had long spread suffering and destruction across countless worlds. He did not hesitate, for hesitation was the luxury of those who had not been forged in the fires of endless conflict. Each swing of his Blades of Chaos carved through the defenders like a scythe through wheat, chains coiling and striking with brutal precision, severing limbs, shattering armor, and scattering the warped minions before him. The closer he drew to the stronghold, the more intense the warp energy became. The very air shimmered and twisted, creating illusions and phantom threats that could drive mortals insane within seconds. Yet Kratos pressed forward with unwavering focus, his mind clear, despite the chaotic onslaught of psychic distortions. The demons attempted to assault him with psychic blasts, claws that ripped at the very essence of his being, and attacks meant to ensnare him within the warped currents of the immaterium. Each strike, however, met with calculated counters, the Blades of Chaos snapping in arcs that shattered psychic constructs, chains wrapping around monstrous forms and hurling them into walls, the impact sending shockwaves that rattled the fortress itself. Every attempt to halt him was met with devastating efficiency, leaving even the most powerful chaos entities struggling to comprehend the force that had arrived in their domain. The fortress gates were enormous, etched with symbols of corruption and encrusted with the ichor of countless sacrifices. Kratos did not pause. He launched chains into the massive hinges, yanking with a force that splintered the metal and sent the gates crashing to the ground. The sound reverberated across the battlefield, a signal of his impending wrath, and within moments, the first waves of Chaos warriors charged to meet him. Berserkers with their twisted chainswords and demon-infused armor advanced with lethal intent, but they were met by the unstoppable tide of Kratos' fury. Each strike was precise yet brutal, his chains wrapping around limbs, torsos, and weapons, tearing through enemies with calculated savagery. Even as he faced multiple assailants at once, his movements were fluid, anticipating their attacks and countering with an instinctual mastery that bordered on the divine. The interior of the stronghold was a labyrinth of jagged halls, each corridor lined with the remnants of past conquests, blood, and the stench of corruption. Kratos moved through them like a force of nature, his chains scouring walls and tearing apart obstacles with ease. The warp seemed to writhe in opposition, twisting the very structure of the fortress, yet he remained undeterred, pressing forward toward the source of the corruption. Greater daemons, towering and grotesque, emerged from the shadows, their forms radiating malevolent energy meant to intimidate and overpower any intruder. They struck in coordination, claws, teeth, and warp-infused weaponry converging on him in a desperate bid to stop the unstoppable. Yet Kratos met each challenge with lethal precision, his movements both reactive and anticipatory, each strike reducing the monstrous threats to nothing more than debris scattered across the corrupted halls. As he progressed, the very architecture of the fortress seemed to react, corridors shifting, walls pulsating with dark energy, and floors collapsing under the weight of ancient, forbidden magics. Kratos adapted with a fluidity that seemed almost preternatural, leaping, twisting, and striking in perfect harmony with the chaos that surrounded him. His rage acted as both shield and weapon, repelling attacks that would have destroyed any ordinary warrior while driving him ever closer to the heart of the stronghold. The warp itself seemed to resist him, as if the forces of chaos were aware that he was a singular threat capable of unraveling their schemes. Yet he pressed on, undaunted, his divine fury acting as a beacon of raw, unrelenting power. Finally, in the deepest chamber of the stronghold, he confronted the source of the corruption, a daemon prince of immense size and malice, radiating energy that threatened to consume all light. Its voice boomed, dripping with contempt, as it called forth legions of lesser daemons to overwhelm him. Kratos' gaze locked onto the daemon prince, unyielding, and with a roar that echoed through the warped halls, he launched himself into the fray. Chains struck first, snapping with force that echoed like thunder, tearing through the surrounding minions and leaving the greater foe exposed. Each movement was deliberate, yet instinctual, combining the lessons of countless battles with the raw, unbridled power of one who had defied gods and monsters alike. The chamber itself shook under the force of their clash, walls cracking, floors splintering, and energy surging as Kratos matched the daemon's attacks with skill and fury. Blades collided with claws and warp energy, sending shockwaves through the structure, yet he pressed forward relentlessly. Each swing, each strike, and each lash of the chains carried the weight of centuries of vengeance and unyielding determination. The lesser daemons, seeing their master under assault, faltered, their coordination unraveling under the terrifying might of a warrior who moved with a purpose beyond their comprehension. Every step Kratos took drove him closer to the center of corruption. Every swing of his chains dismantling the defenses that centuries of malevolence had erected. His relentless advance became a testament to the force of his will, a combination of tactical acumen and unbridled rage that shattered even the most formidable obstacles in his path. The warp twisted and shrieked around him, but he remained steady, undeterred, a singular presence that brought inevitability to the chaotic fortress and a certainty of destruction to those who had long relied on its power. Imperial commanders watched from their fortified observation posts, faces pale under the flickering glow of hololithic screens that displayed the devastation unfolding across the battlefield. They had faced countless threats over the centuries: renegade warlords, Tyranid invasions, Ork wogs, even incursions of demonic entities. But none of these horrors compared to the singular, unrelenting force that had appeared among their ranks: Kratos, the Ghost of Sparta. Moved with a deliberate, terrifying precision, cutting through formations of soldiers, armored vehicles, and monstrous war machines as though they were no more than straw effigies. Each strike of his blades of chaos and lash of his chains left behind carnage that was both overwhelming in scale and meticulously controlled, a paradox of chaos and order that left commanders struggling to comprehend the reality before them. The sound of bolter fire, lascannons, and the roar of engines was drowned beneath the chorus of destruction that followed his every step, a grim symphony that demanded attention and provoked awe. Orders were shouted, strategies revised in real time, but the effectiveness of every command was immediately undermined by Kratos' singular focus and overwhelming strength. Units that had been drilled for years, disciplined to react with inhuman efficiency, were all overwhelmed, found their formations breaking apart as he tore through their lines. Even the elite Space Marines, paragons of tactical precision and physical superiority, were forced onto the defensive, reacting instinctively rather than executing coordinated counterattacks. The commanders observed, helpless and horrified, as the battlefield transformed from a calculated theater of war into a dynamic crucible where every traditional advantage, terrain, numbers, superior firepower, was rendered meaningless in the face of one warrior's wrath. Their instruments, normally reliable in predicting enemy movement, faltered as Kratos' actions defied conventional logic, rendering premeditated strategies impotent. The question that haunted every officer present was simple but terrifying. Should they worship, fear, or attempt to destroy him? Some considered the possibility of reverence, for beings of his caliber were often deified in human myth and legend, and his power was godlike even by the standards of the Imperium. Yet others recognized the mortal danger he represented, a force that had already annihilated thousands of troops and laid waste to fortifications designed to withstand orbital bombardment. Attempts at negotiation were unthinkable. There was no time, no opportunity, no clear method to communicate with a being whose understanding of war and vengeance transcended mortal comprehension. The commanders realized that in this moment, conventional morality, strategy, and hierarchy were irrelevant. Their decisions boiled down to one primal instinct: survival. As Kratos advanced, the psychological impact on the Imperium's leadership was profound. Veteran officers, hardened by decades of combat and familiar with horrors that would make ordinary men tremble, found their composure challenged. The chains coiled around his arms seemed almost sentient, striking with an intelligence that precluded anticipation. Vehicles were shredded, fortifications collapsed, and entire squads of troops were hurled aside as if weightless. It was not merely the physical destruction that unsettled them, but the sense that conventional warfare was no longer applicable. Every action, every calculated maneuver, and every piece of tactical equipment became secondary to the unstoppable momentum of a warrior who seemed impervious to reason, strategy, and fear. In the midst of the chaos, commanders debated the risks of committing their forces fully to an assault against him. Some suggested concentrated firepower, orbital strikes, or coordinated barrages that had succeeded against titanic threats before. Yet each suggestion was met with the same grim evidence. Kratos moved through barrages, explosions, and concentrated fire with ease, his chains deflecting rounds, his blades cleaving armored vehicles in a single swing. Even the combined might of multiple titans and siege tanks seemed insufficient to slow him down. The commanders recognized a terrifying truth. Their calculations were based on conventional models of engagement, but they were now confronting a variable that could not be modeled, predicted, or contained. Moral authority, discipline, and protocol faltered under the weight of the moment. Junior officers froze, unsure whether to advance, retreat, or issue orders that would inevitably be ignored by reality itself. Veterans barked commands in desperation, their words drowned by the crescendo of destruction that Kratos orchestrated with instinctual perfection. The battlefield became a mirror of the Imperium's collective fear and awe, each unit reacting less to orders and more to the visceral, immediate presence of unstoppable power. Soldiers and leaders alike began to measure their own effectiveness in terms of survival rather than victory, their minds conditioned to expect failure in the face of a foe whose sheer momentum defied comprehension. The question of whether to destroy him became increasingly urgent. Calculated strikes, heavy artillery, and coordinated attacks all proved futile, leaving commanders to contemplate desperate measures. Some considered extreme tactics, luring him into traps, sacrificing entire regiments to slow his advance, or using forbidden weapons that had been outlawed even in the most desperate scenarios. Yet Kratos moved with uncanny anticipation, reacting instinctively to threats that were intended to ensnare or overwhelm him. Every action taken against him resulted in further devastation, reinforcing the sense that conventional methods of warfare were inadequate. The leadership realized they were in a unique position, forced to confront an adversary whose existence blurred the line between myth and reality, mortal and god. Even from command observation points far from the front lines, the destructive power of Kratos was impossible to ignore. Smoke and debris rose in enormous plumes, artillery and weapons fire detonating across the terrain, and entire sections of fortifications crumbled like sandcastles under his relentless assault. Yet, amid the chaos, he did not move recklessly. Every action, every strike, and every leap carried purpose, precision, and an awareness that seemed almost preternatural. Commanders began to recognize a terrifying paradox. He was both unstoppable and deliberate, a force of divine vengeance capable of obliterating entire armies, yet operating with the strategic acumen of the most seasoned general. In that moment, the Imperium's leaders faced a dilemma that transcended tactical calculation. Kratos' power, his speed, and his singular focus on destruction forced them to confront the limits of their authority, the inadequacy of their strategies, and the fragility of human life in the face of such overwhelming force. Worship, fear, or destruction. Each choice carried profound consequences, yet none promised security or success. The battlefield itself became a testament to this realization, a landscape scarred by violence that reflected not only physical destruction, but the psychological toll of facing an entity that rendered the hierarchy, planning, and discipline of the Imperium nearly irrelevant. Kratos pressed forward through the shattered ruins of the battlefield, his every step a testament to the unrelenting force that had already begun to reshape the landscape itself. Buildings that had once stood as bastions of the Imperium's defenses now lay in splintered ruin, twisted steel and shattered stone littering the ground. Smoke and fire rose in thick, suffocating plumes, mingling with the acrid scent of blood and ozone as the air itself seemed charged with the residual energy of destruction. The Space Marines and Imperial Guard that remained attempted to regroup, their disciplined formations strained to the breaking point by the sheer magnitude of his assault. Even those accustomed to fighting the most horrific and powerful enemies found themselves faltering, instinctively recognizing that Kratos was unlike anything they had ever faced. His presence was not merely a threat, it was a declaration that the normal rules of engagement no longer applied. The battlefield reverberated with the sounds of combat. Bolters cracked and engines roared. Yet these noises seemed almost incidental compared to the thunderous impact of Kratos' chains and the metallic scream of his blades of chaos slicing through armor. He moved with a calculated fury, weaving through the ranks of Space Marines and Orc mobs alike, anticipating attacks before they could be executed and countering with an instinctive precision honed over centuries of combat. Every swing of his chains coiled around armored limbs or shattered weapons. Every strike of his blades cleaved through flesh and metal alike, leaving a trail of devastation in his wake. Commanders shouted orders, attempting to redirect their forces or mount a coordinated assault, but it quickly became apparent that their strategies were inadequate. Kratos operated on a level beyond conventional warfare, and no amount of planning, coordination, or firepower could halt his advance. The Orcs, driven by their crude cunning and overwhelming numbers, tried to overwhelm him with brute force. War bosses roared and charged, their massive choppas swinging with destructive intent. Yet each assault was met with calculated brutality. Chains wrapped around limbs and torsos, snapping bones and hurling massive creatures into one another or into the wreckage that surrounded them. Tyranid creatures attempted to flank him, their swarms moving with the instinctive coordination of a hive mind. Yet they found themselves caught off guard by his preemptive strikes and lethal awareness of their movements. Even the mightiest predators of the Tyranid race, hulking and armored, were torn asunder by the combined precision and raw strength of Kratos' attacks. The battlefield became a chaotic tableau of destruction, with each swing and strike reshaping the landscape and asserting his dominance over both mortal and alien forces. Kratos' fury was not merely physical. It carried a psychological weight that rippled through every combatant present. Soldiers froze, even as they tried to fire upon him, their minds assaulted by the undeniable presence of a being whose power and focus transcended mortal comprehension. The bravest of Space Marines found themselves hesitating mid-strike, their instincts warning them that their attacks were futile. That every swing of a blade or discharge of a bolter would be met with devastating retaliation. Even the orcs, creatures bred for aggression and recklessness, recoiled from his chains and the precision with which he dismantled their formations. Tyranids hesitated, their hive instincts disrupted by the overwhelming aura of violence and dominance that emanated from him. Each step Kratos took created ripples of fear, uncertainty, and awe, altering the flow of combat, not through strategy, but sheer presence. The battlefield itself seemed to react to Kratos' movement. Walls crumbled under the force of his strikes. Vehicles were thrown into the air by the momentum of his chains, and the ground quaked as he moved with deliberate weight. Explosions erupted not only from his attacks, but seemingly in response to the energy that radiated from him, as though the very universe recognized that this was a force beyond ordinary comprehension. Smoke, dust, and embers mingled in the air, creating an almost tangible barrier that shrouded his movements, yet he cut through it unimpeded, striking at enemies who thought themselves safely hidden. Fortifications that had been designed to withstand orbital bombardment failed against the combination of his strength and tactical instinct. Each barrier that fell served as both a physical and psychological marker of the inevitability of his advance. The Space Marines attempted to mount a coordinated response, concentrating fire from heavy weapons and engaging with precision strikes designed to exploit any weakness. Yet Kratos moved with an almost supernatural awareness, dodging, parrying, and countering with fluidity that rendered their efforts ineffective. Chains wrapped around weapons and limbs alike, tearing apart the elite warriors and sending them tumbling into the wreckage. Even their most disciplined squads, trained to respond to unimaginable threats with calm and deadly efficiency, were forced onto the defensive, reacting to him rather than dictating the pace of combat. The imperviousness of his assault reshaped the very concept of battlefield control, leaving commanders to witness their forces crumble under a force that no conventional strategy could contain. Kratos' eyes, burning with intensity, scanned constantly, seeking the next threat, the next opponent who dared to challenge him. Even in moments of brief pause, his presence radiated authority and menace, commanding attention and demanding acknowledgement. The Chaos Forces, sensing the rising tide of destruction, attempted to rally demonic entities and corrupted warriors in a last-ditch effort to stem his advance. Yet Kratos struck with relentless precision, cutting down both leaders and their followers, leaving confusion and terror in his wake. Each strike was both tactical and brutal, balancing the efficiency of a seasoned warrior with the raw, godlike power that defined him. Amid the carnage, the battlefield became an almost surreal theater. Smoke and flame twisted into shifting patterns. Debris flew through the air from shattered vehicles and collapsing buildings, and the sounds of combat collided in a deafening cacophony. Yet through all of it, Kratos remained a singular, unstoppable force, moving with a focus and clarity that contrasted sharply with the chaos surrounding him. The presence of so much destruction, so much violence, would have overwhelmed any mortal force, but he seemed to feed off it, drawing strength and momentum from the battlefield itself. His chains coiled and whipped with hypnotic rhythm, each swing a calculation of power, angle, and consequence, as though the very environment were an extension of his will. Even as reinforcements arrived, bringing fresh squads of soldiers, tanks, and heavy artillery, the impact of Kratos' presence continued to ripple outward. The battlefield had been transformed. It was no longer simply a site of war, but a crucible where the natural rules of combat had been rewritten. Every line of defense broken, every squad annihilated, and every structure destroyed was a testament to his singular dominance. Soldiers, orcs, Tyranids, and demons alike reacted not merely to his attacks, but to the inevitability of his path, a recognition that whatever plan they might devise, whatever strength they might muster, he would adapt, overcome, and continue onward, reshaping the battlefield in his wake. The battlefield lay in ruins under the relentless advance of Kratos, a godlike figure whose presence seemed to warp reality itself. Smoke and ash filled the sky, mingling with the acrid scent of burning fuel and charred flesh as the remnants of Imperial forces and alien invaders struggled to maintain any semblance of cohesion. Each swing of the Blades of Chaos carved through armor, flesh, and steel with terrifying efficiency, leaving devastation in its wake that was both awe-inspiring and horrifying. The ground shook beneath his feet, fissures spreading like veins through the battlefield, as if the very earth itself recognized the force of his wrath. Soldiers, both human and alien, froze in disbelief at the sight of a single warrior dismantling entire squads and vehicles with a combination of strength, skill, and divine fury that defied comprehension. Chaos erupted wherever Kratos moved. Orc mobs, driven by their crude instincts and overwhelming numbers, surged forward with guttural shouts, axes and choppas swinging in wild arcs. Yet their attacks, meant to overwhelm, were systematically dismantled by the precision and raw power of Kratos' strikes. Chains coiled around limbs and torsos, snapping bone and tearing apart both flesh and armor as he hurled massive combatants into one another, leaving carnage and confusion in his wake. Tyranid creatures, instinctively coordinated through the Synapse network, attempted to flank him, their swarms converging in a desperate bid to overwhelm him with numbers. But Kratos moved with uncanny anticipation, reading the flow of combat with an almost supernatural clarity. His chains and blades struck simultaneously, dismantling multiple foes in a single sweeping motion, leaving nothing but shattered remains and scattering debris. The Imperial forces were not spared from his unstoppable assault. Space Marines, paragons of strategy, strength, and combat skill, attempted to engage him directly, firing bolters, wielding chainswords, and deploying tactical maneuvers honed over centuries. Yet each attack was met with precise counters, his movements fluid and unhesitating, striking with lethal intent at both the weapon and the wielder. Tanks and titans, designed to crush armies beneath their mechanical might, were torn apart, limbs ripped from their frames, engines exploded, and hulls torn asunder. The battlefield became a cacophony of destruction, where every conventional weapon was rendered ineffective against the sheer ferocity and tactical genius of one being. Commanders struggled to adapt, issuing orders that could not keep pace with the devastation unfolding before them. Kratos' influence extended beyond mere physical destruction. His presence created a psychological storm that rippled through both ally and enemy ranks alike. Soldiers hesitated, unsure whether to advance or retreat, instinctively recognizing the futility of resistance against a warrior whose combat prowess and divine strength surpassed anything they had faced. Even the Orks, whose entire culture celebrated brute strength and aggression, faltered in fear. Their mobs disorganized and leaderless as Kratos tore through their numbers with systematic precision. Tyranids hesitated mid-charge, instinctively aware that the predator before them was unlike any they had encountered, a being that operated beyond the instinctual calculus of survival and conquest. The chaos extended to the very terrain. Fortifications built to withstand bombardment collapsed under the force of his chains and blades. Barricades splintered and vehicles overturned, creating new hazards that were navigated with uncanny agility. Explosions erupted, triggered both by direct assault and by the environmental havoc his movements caused, sending plumes of fire and debris into the sky. Smoke obscured vision, yet Kratos moved unhindered, tracking every threat with the precision of a seasoned warrior and the instinct of a predator, honed through centuries of battle. Each step forward was deliberate, each strike a balance of measured force and uncontrolled fury, transforming the battlefield into a living testament to his unstoppable presence. The warp itself seemed to react to his arrival. Daemonic forces surged, attempting to ensnare him through psychic manipulation and sheer numbers, but the energy around Kratos seemed impervious to their influence. He moved through ethereal attacks as if they were wind, striking with a combination of physical precision and instinctual anticipation that left daemons reeling. Greater daemons, their forms monstrous and unnatural, lunged with terrifying force. Yet Kratos met each assault with fluid efficiency, his chains coiling and snapping, his blades cutting cleanly through corrupted flesh and armor alike. The floor quaked, walls shattered, and the air shimmered with the energy of battle, creating a scene of apocalyptic chaos that no strategy or force could resist. Every action Kratos took was a blend of brutal efficiency and instinctive foresight. Lesser enemies were annihilated to clear his path, while greater threats were assessed and neutralized with calculated force. Even when faced with simultaneous attacks from multiple directions, he adapted instantly, his movements a seamless dance of destruction that left no room for retaliation. Artillery strikes, concentrated fire, and coordinated counterattacks were rendered useless. Dismantled before they could take effect. The battlefield no longer adhered to conventional rules. It existed as a crucible shaped entirely by the movements and will of Kratos. As the battle wore on, the impact of his presence extended beyond physical and tactical considerations. Morale shattered among the surviving forces, both human and alien, as they recognized that their strength, discipline, and numbers were insufficient to halt him. Commanders observed their troops faltering, panic spreading faster than any enemy advance, and realized that the very concept of victory was meaningless against a force that ignored the boundaries of possibility. Reinforcements sent to stabilize the lines were met with the same devastating efficiency, their approach foreseen and dismantled before they could even reach engagement range. Amid the chaos, Kratos continued to advance, a singular force moving inexorably toward the heart of enemy lines. Every swing of his chains, every slash of his blades, and every step he took reshaped the battlefield itself, leaving a trail of ruin that would be remembered in both history and legend. Soldiers, monsters, and daemons alike were left in awe and terror, realizing that resistance against him was futile, and that the battlefield had been transformed from a theater of war into an arena defined entirely by the unstoppable fury of a god unleashed.